I was wrong. I produced a video here a couple weeks ago that I made some mistakes in it as the election process was being analyzed in Washington State. And let me correct the record right now, plus give you some ideas of different things you can do to make a difference in the 2022 elections. Thank you for watching. My name is Glen Morgan, and this is We the Govern. So I wanted to make a point that I was wrong in the last video that I produced a while ago. I'm going to deal with that issue, and it has to do with the Joe Kent race, but also I'm going to address another issue that had to do with voter turnout and a deeper analysis of what actually happened this primary election cycle and what you can do to make a difference as we move forward. So let's talk about how I was wrong. I was wrong because in my last video, I know we're only a couple days into the election cycle, and I always say this, that we aren't really, there's no such thing as election day in Washington State. We have election month because we send our ballots out weeks before election day. We collect them in our state, and then they keep counting them for weeks, and who the heck knows what the final results are, oftentimes for weeks before they're certified. Now, the election results are certified now. We know what the final numbers are. And in the end, and this is actually a couple days after I started my last video, it turns out in the 3rd Congressional District, which is my congressional district, that's where I live, the Joe Kent actually was able to prevail in that race. And it was very unusual because he came from a substantial deficit that, at least the way it looked on election night, and he was able to move up almost 5 points to get ahead of Jamie Butler, who was the incumbent Republican congresswoman in this area. And as many people know, there was a lot of controversy with her taking impeachment votes against Trump and becoming kind of an anti-Trump person. That alienated a lot of the base in her district, clearly alienated a lot of the base, and they were looking for change. And Joe Kent capitalized on that, even in a crowded Republican field, and looks like he's going to be the Republican candidate moving forward. So that was very, very different, and that was not what I was expecting to see when I saw the initial batch of ballots and the results after just a couple days after Election Day. So that's interesting. I want to get into this a little bit more because there were a number of stories that came out just days after I did the last video about Jamie Butler conceding and Joe Kent taking the lead. And this was a big deal. This big shift was a big deal. And so that's made national news, and it did encourage a lot of conservative activists in Washington State, knowing that they can have a result like this and get somebody who's clearly not an establishment person, or at least not endorsed by the establishment for sure, getting them into office. Which I do want to point out, it led the Spokesman Review to do an article like this, which had raised the question of, hey, if elections are rigged, how did Joe Kent actually win his primary in this late come-from-behind win? That's a good question. Now, I generally have not been impressed with the incompetent reporting that the Spokesman Review has done, especially on election integrity issues as it relates to the really horrific auditor that they have in Spokane County. However, this is a good question, and I want to address it. Now, they want to address it in a way to make fun of Joe Kent, but it's definitely worth pointing out to people who believe that the system is completely rigged top to bottom, that sometimes you can have unexpected outcomes if you get out and actually run a serious campaign and run a smart campaign. You can make a difference, and you can prevail even when you think that everything is not going your way. Now, I have been a frequent critic of our election process in Washington State. I've been working a long time on trying to clean up the voter rolls. Related issues with the Washington Voter Research Project that I've been working on now with a lot of volunteers, doorbelling and trying to clean some of the stuff up. So I am a critic and I have a lot of things to criticize, but that doesn't mean that the entire system in every way is rigged. It means that you can have outcomes that you aren't expecting if you're willing to get out there and vote. And let's talk about some of the things that Joe Kent had going for him in this race that made it easier for him to have this kind of an outcome, despite the fact that it looked like he was just coming from behind and really an outsider coming into this race. I will point out that he was endorsed by Donald Trump. There's no way anybody can deny that that actually helped him, particularly with the base. There's a lot of people that hate Trump. They don't like the fact that Trump endorses, or they want to downplay the fact that Trump has endorsed anybody. But the reality is, especially in a Republican primary, that's going to carry well, and that's going to make a big difference. It clearly made a big difference in the volunteers that he had. Joe Kent was well-funded. He raised millions of dollars. This was not an underfunded campaign or a story of the truck driver out of New Jersey beating somebody with only $5,000 in the bank. This is a story of somebody who did fundraise pretty well and got a lot of money into their campaign. In addition, I suspect mainly because of the Trump endorsement and the high media profile he had, he was able just to get a ton of volunteers coming out there to help him. And it was all the more impressive that this was all able to come together in a very crowded Republican field that I think, because of the Republican infighting, I think it reduced some of the donations that you would have otherwise seen, and it made a lot of the volunteers a little bit more hesitant, because in a crowded Republican field, it's inevitable that you're going to have divisions, like an intramural fight, and you don't want to get into a shouting match with your friend supporting the other candidate who you're going to work with in a few months on the candidate with whoever comes through. So there's a lot of those kind of dynamics that make it difficult, certainly to take out an incumbent, which is pretty impressive, but also to run a campaign as well as you need to in the primary. So that was an interesting thing. Now, I'm going to point out that there was a tactic that Joe Kent's campaign did that probably didn't get a lot of notice, but if you understand Washington State's top 2 primary system, this actually can make a big difference. And that is, he did a large ad buy, about 1/8 of his advertising budget online, actually targeting Democrats and then going after the Democrat candidate and attacking the Democrat candidate. Actually, of all the Republicans running for office, he was almost alone in really directing a sizable budget to attacking the Democrat candidate. Now, that's counterintuitive in a primary, because what that's inevitably going to do is it's going to encourage more Democrats to turn out and vote, who would otherwise probably feel like they could be fairly apathetic because they only had one Democrat on the ballot who was going to be coming through, presumably, to the general no matter what, the general election in November. But in Washington State's top 2 primaries, we've seen happen in a number of other races around the state, it's always possible that you could get 2 people from the same party. And from Joe Kent's strategy, from the background that he'd be looking at, he's trying to beat, not just, he needs to beat this incumbent, but he also needs to have the Democrat beat the incumbent. And it did look like Democrat turnout in the 3rd Congressional District wasn't going to be great. So that was fairly counterintuitive. It drove Democrat turnout for that Democrat, which in a top 2 primary simply means that now it's going to be Joe Kent versus the Democrat for sure. That was a fairly unorthodox and brave move to take, risky move anyway, for a campaign to take, and I thought that that worked pretty well in his race. Whether he really needed it or not, who knows, but it sure looks like it might have made a bit of a difference for him. The other thing is he uniquely, of all the candidates I saw in Washington State, really went out and emphasized, because of his concerns over voter integrity issues and the ability that's not, and this isn't illegal, but the ability to use matchbacks to track voting turnout of various political persuasions. He waited, and he recommended all his supporters wait till the last day or the day before the last day to go and hand deliver, don't put them in the mail, but hand deliver those ballots directly to the auditor's office or directly to a drop box. Why that matters is that many of us who have been looking at some of the voter integrity issues have seen a lot of problems with the U.S. Postal Service. Tons of problems, actually. And the Postal Service has also been going through some downsizing. And so there's a big chance, many people I know who have experienced this, where they put their ballot in, they think it's plenty of time, and then the ballot gets rejected because they say it's too late. The post office fails to stamp it, to document when they get it. There's all kinds of other problems that the post office has had involved in mail-in voting. So bypassing the post office and only going to drop boxes, that's one thing. But the second thing is waiting till that late period of time, right to the end, and dropping them in is not the way most political insiders promote voting during a mail-in voting process like we have in Washington. Usually they say get it in as early as you can, because you always run the risk of people forgetting about Election Day or running around that day and just forgetting that they even have to go down and turn it in. And there were reports from Clark County, which is the biggest county in this district, of long lines at the auditor's office just to drop the ballots off. So clearly Joe Kent's recommendations got out to a lot of people, a surprisingly large percentage of people, and they did wait till the last minute to turn it in, which is why you saw that sudden shift of votes go to Joe Kent that's very disproportionate to a typical profile of an election. So that's a big deal. And that's what happened in the Joe Kent race, and that's why I was wrong when I did my last video just a couple days after the election cycle. Now, let's talk about voter turnout and kind of what we see now that the election results are finalized. Obviously, it wasn't great, and most insiders have kind of, when I say political insiders, those who believe they're political insiders, they have generally said that the perception is, yes, the voter turnout was not great, but it was about equal for Republicans and Democrats. What was really different is that what they call these independents, they're the ones that didn't show up much at all. That's kind of their analysis. Now, I think those are relatively fuzzy numbers because we don't register by party in Washington state. There are ways you can use, if you have decent data, database analysis, looking at historical voting patterns from the 2016, 2020 elections, you can kind of tell some number of Democrats and Republicans, but really understanding what that unidentified voter middle number is, that's a little bit more of a guesswork. But that's at least the story that we're hearing from political insiders. And if you want to see election results, I always recommend go to Secretary of State's website, sos.wa.gov, and you can see it here. I have a screen capture. Voter turnout ended up after the final numbers and those ballots trickling in for weeks to be at 40.43%. And when I posted this similar screen capture page in my last video, it was at 26%. So that's the large percentage that came in late. And those are some of the votes, as I discussed in the Joe Kent story, that shifted in his direction. But how different was this voter turnout profile compared to other midterm races, other midterm primary races in Washington state? Well, as you see here, 2022, we had 40.43%. But frankly, it wasn't that much different than 2018, which was just about the same level, and 2010, which was also about the same amount, just slightly over 40% both years. And the only one that was an outlier to the worst level was 2014, which was just over 30%. So we really didn't, as bad as this turnout was, and it was bad, it really didn't, it doesn't stand out as an anomaly when you look back on some of these midterm election cycles. And when you really compare it and include even the presidential election cycles, it wasn't too much of a standout. It wasn't the worst, it wasn't the best. In fact, if we look at it, the best turnout that we've had in a primary during a presidential race, too, was actually in 2020, where we had a 54.4%, which has been the highest primary voter turnout even during the presidential race for a long, long time. As far back as I'm aware of, with any of the records I can easily access without going into the archives. Interestingly enough, again, still the lowest was 2014 during the Obama administration at 34.88%. So that's been the lowest that we've seen in a primary race. And so when you look at this year's 2022 primary turnout, yes, it sucks, but it doesn't. It's not so far out of line that it's an outlier. It's not too far off of what we've seen in the past. 2010, 2008, those are all very similar numbers. So we need to get out and vote more. We need to get more people involved. Now, I know the question, and I addressed this early on and said I was going to talk about some things that we need to have people do or to encourage you to do if you want to actually make an impact. Because I know there's plenty of people watching this video who probably did nothing in the primary and you didn't help anybody and you were just kind of demoralized contemplating your future or I don't know what. A lot of people have a lot of reasons, and if you read the media, there's an active effort by any of the traditional media campaigns or outlets in Washington state in particular to really depress Republican voter turnout. They want you to believe that there's no hope, please don't turn out. They encourage that. And if you're having a steady diet of that type of media, I'm not surprised if you're demoralized because they certainly don't want you to come out and vote. But I encourage everybody to get together, have whatever way it takes for you to sit down and get direction. You can pray about it. There's all different kinds of ways that you can take to get centered and decide how can you make a difference over the next few months to have an impact on liberty and freedom in this state and in that election process that I think is going to be a critical part of making that difference. I don't know how everybody does it in a different way. However it is that you become centered or you're looking for inspiration or direction, there are some things I believe that you can do to make a difference. And one thing you have to do is get off the couch, right? You can't achieve anything if you stay home and do nothing. 60% of people who refused or didn't want to or forgot to vote during the primary don't matter. They were totally irrelevant and they had no impact at all in the situation that we're in other than by their absence probably making it worse. So you have to get off the couch, you have to get out and be involved, be engaged. You have to do something. The other thing is that everybody likes to be on their phones all the time. Listen, we all do it, but sometimes you're gonna have to get off the phone and actually go out and do something practical, something that requires you to reach out and touch people in a way that's more than just a comment on Facebook or a TikTok video or even a comment on this video, as much as I appreciate them. Sometimes you're gonna have to get out and do stuff in the field, put up signs, volunteer for campaigns, or here's a very practical thing that you can do without necessarily reaching out that far. Find 10 of your closest friends, or if you don't have 10 friends, whatever number of friends you have or family members, and encourage them to vote. Just make sure they aren't part of that uninvolved or uncaring or apathetic group, or just simply too busy and they forget about it, group that doesn't vote. Washington State's made voting easier than anything else that we can do in our lives. So let's make sure they have their ballot. If they aren't registered to vote, get them registered to vote. There's not too many people that aren't registered to vote, but if you can get them registered to vote, that'd be great. Get them out there and help them make sure they fill out their ballots and get it mailed in. And one thing you can do is organize after the ballots get mailed out. You can organize events where you get together and have ballot parties. I know people that do that. The Democrats are pretty good at encouraging their people to do this all the time. There's a lot of leftist groups that drive that type of activity. They do it because it's effective and it works. And if you can convince 4 or 5 or 10 of your friends to get together, discuss the candidates, and fill out the ballots while you're talking about it, that's one way of getting a bunch more votes, probably for the same people that you want to get into office. So anything you can do to encourage people to get out and vote, that makes a difference, especially if they're people who share your beliefs. Because what's stopping you? It's not me. I'm not stopping you. The Democrats aren't stopping you from doing that. The left isn't stopping you from doing that. That's you. You're choosing to not do it. So what's stopping you to get out there and be more engaged and involved? Hopefully I can inspire you to get out there and do that. If it's not me, hopefully it's somebody else. But one way or another, we have to get out and make an impact in our community, because even if you don't care about politics, it cares about you. And it's going to impact your life, whether it's education, taxes, crime, or whatever other issues that you can't avoid. They are going to come and impact you one way or the other. Let's find a way to at least have an impact in this little way that we can with our political process. We're in the middle of an election cycle. It's always better to do something rather than sit back and complain about what we didn't do what we didn't do something about in the past. So, as I always say, the future belongs to those who show up. Please show up. Feel free to add your comments below if you think I missed something. I'll always make sure that I get back to as many of them as I can, and I look forward to seeing you next time.